Hey guys, it's Navinat on No Limit Hold'em. We're talking about position today in the first video of what I hope will be a video series called Mastering the Fundamentals. But guys, if you want to see this type of video, post it in the comments or like it, and I'll do more of this. I definitely enjoy making these conceptual videos, and if you find it helpful, kind of let me know and I'll put out more of them. So this first one, position, is obviously a very important thing to understand and get your head around, but the first question I think you need to address in your own mind, learning to play poker profitably, before you can really embrace before you can embrace the ways, the methods, the techniques that you might use to wield this advantage, this positional edge, is you have to answer the question for yourself: how important is position really? And I just want to say, statistically speaking, probably, in all likelihood, however important you think position is right now, it is almost certainly more important than that in reality. And depending on where you're at in your poker education, it could be more important than you think it is by orders of magnitude. I mean, it could be a lot bigger deal than what you're thinking it is right now. And I know it could sound like it's just a dramatized or romanticized notion. I know you've heard people talk about how big a deal position is, and you might think it's one of these bandwagon concepts that people jump on and talk about to sound intelligent or sound learned or sound like they're part of the in crowd, but it is not the case. That's not what the deal is. The deal is that it is very difficult to win money out of position in No Limit Hold'em. And the money that is won and lost has a tendency to flow around a, say, full ring game table in a clockwise manner. And that's all because of the importance of position. You, simply stated, will lose less money when you lose. You'll win bigger pots when you win the pots. And that's all there is to it, really. But that's all there is to poker. So it's really a very big deal. So you might ask then, okay, so where does the edge come from? Okay, so one way to look at this is when you're playing, let's say you're playing heads up. If you're playing against another opponent, you're taking your strategy and you're ramming it into your opponent's strategy. And the way those two strategies interact is going to decide who wins money and who loses money. You can take that just a little bit further or a little bit more detailed, or you can look at it a little more finely and say that what you're really doing is you're running your ranges into your opponent's ranges. Now, every time a player acts on their hand, they split their range. Anytime you exercise your right to make a decision in this game to check or to bet or whatever your decision is at that decision point, you split your range into more than one range that your hand is obviously now a part of, and you exclude a batch of hands from the hands that you're likely to hold. And you can't not do that except to cost yourself money mathematically. So, not only do you have to split your range before you know what your opponent's going to do when you're playing out of position, but then your opponent gets to split their range based on your actions. So it's kind of like a double negative. It's almost like you're at a disadvantage and your opponent's at an advantage. I know that's kind of redundant, but it's kind of like that in a way, because not only are you acting on your hand like blindfolded, but your opponent's not blindfolded and actually gets to see what you decided to do with your blindfold on. So it's the way that works out is it creates a really big gap between the player that's out of position and the player that's in position. And there's only three, if you're talking specifically about going post-flop, there's only three advantages you can have after the flop comes out. You can just make better lines, have cleaner lines, or you could call it a skill advantage, a skill edge, just having a better overall strategy or feel for the game, or you're just making better decisions. You're just better at poker, better at playing poker. You can have this skill advantage, we'll call it. Or you can start with the stronger range or the actual better hand. We'll call that card edge or card advantage. and then the only other thing you can have is a positional edge or a positional advantage. And people will ask sometimes, which is the most important edge, or what's more important, position or playing skill, or what's more important, position or card strength. And the truth is about that question, it's kind of a non-starter. It's not a logically coherent question, because the reality is those three edges are woven together in very tightly in a way that it's really hard to tease one out by itself and analyze it in a vacuum without it being without kind of looking at it in relation to the other edges. But I will say this, that the deeper you get, the less true that is. I mean, as your stack to pot ratio climbs, the importance of position gets bigger. And and in the same token, as your stack to pot ratio gets smaller, the card advantage actually does become bigger. But in the middle ground, they kind of just are intertwined. But position it's at least as important to understand as anything else in the game. Your decision points split your ranges. You have to act on your hand in a way that's going to split your range, and you have to do that with regard to your opponent's range. So not only being out of position are you giving off additional information, but the player in position is able to use that information, and they're not giving off information for you to use. And the advantage of this kind of stacks up throughout the hand. The deeper you go throughout the hand, because for one, the bigger the pot gets, and the other thing is you've been able to make these decisions one decision point at a time, and at each decision point in the hand, you've been one decision point ahead the entire time. So it's a real big deal, I guess is the short way to put it. This idea that anytime a player acts on their hand, they split their range, they segment their range off, it's a pretty big deal. So let's say that you start with, arbitrarily 20 hands that you could have. It's your opponent's job to try to, kind of put you on a range of hands and then start to narrow your range down. I mean, that's really where the skill of poker comes into play, is if your opponent's in position and you're acting out of position, let's say you have 20 hands to start with. Understand this, if your opponent could see your hand, they could play perfectly against you, right? Okay, so now you're looking at your opponent's 20 hands that he could possibly have. He's looking at the 20 hands you could possibly have. Well, you've got to cut your number of hands into some number of, maybe two piles, one that wants to check, one that wants to bet at every decision point. It could be more complicated than that, because some want to check raise, some want to check call, some want to check fold. But even just looking at just right on the flop, let's say it's a limped pot. You're small blind, your opponent's big blind, you limp in, he checks his option, flop comes out, action's on you, check or bet. Well, if your opponent thinks you've got these 20 hands, by checking, you've taken, before you check or bet, you've got to make two piles of starting hands. And as soon as you act on either checking or betting on that street, you've told your opponent that you're in one of those two piles of, say, 10 hands. So now your opponent has been able to range you more specifically than you've been able to range them, and you had to act already. You already had to make a decision. Not only that, but now they get to make a decision, and they don't have to split their range until after they've made that decision. So then you go into the next street, and you're playing catch-up, and it's a game you can never really catch up from until it's your turn to be in position. So it's this range-splitting idea, and the idea that the player that's in position is better able to control the size of the pot. That's kind of the 1-2 combo that makes position such a big deal. Not only are you acting on your hand with more information, but you're also acting on your hand with giving your opponent less information. And the way that you're acting on your hand essentially is by controlling how many bets go into the pot before you allow your opponent the opportunity to see a showdown. Anytime you take one range and run it into another range, you're going to get some some nonlinear hierarchies. There's going to be it's going to be very uncommon. It's not very often that your range looks like a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, and your opponent's range looks like a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10. It's usually a lot different than that. It's like, polar versus bluff catcher, or a range that looks mostly value but has a couple of bluffs, or mostly showdown value with some slow plays. Again, it's just more complicated than, well, my range is a little bit stronger than my opponent's range. And the fact that you're able to control the size of the pot in a lot of these like polar versus bluff catcher shootouts, it's immense. It's a really big deal. If for instance, you have a hand that wants to get exactly 1 bet in, and your opponent has a hand that would like to get 3 bets in, and you're in position, you're just in a better spot to decide who wins that battle, or especially if the discrepancy is bigger. Let's say that one player wants to play for stacks, and the other player wants to get to showdown as inexpensively as possible. Or one player would like to put a bet in on this street against the weaker part of the other player's range, but would like to fold to the stronger part of the opponent's range. That's not easy to do when you're out of position. You check, your opponent bets, and you don't know what to do. If you're in position with that same kind of situation where you would like to get 1 bet in from the weaker part of your opponent's range and avoid putting a bet in against the stronger part of your opponent's range, well, when you're in position and your opponent checks, you can just check back. Or there's going to be times when you've got a draw and you'd like to take a card off. You don't think you've got the fold equity, you think you would have the implied odds, so you can just check and take a card off. Your opponent who's playing out of position is simply not able to dictate how big the pot gets and assure that they see showdown. When you're in position, you can set the price to see showdown, and you do this with 1 extra street's worth of information at every decision point in the hand. It's a big deal. I don't know how much of that got through or how much of that sank in for you. I hope you get what I'm saying, but if not, I think I can solidify it with just a few examples. Let's say that we're playing a 3-bet pot with pocket kings. Okay, so either, let's say we open under the gun, and under the gun +1, who's a super tight knit at a full ring game at your local 2-5 no limit hold'em casino game. You're known as a tight player. Your opponent's a regular who's a super knit. You've got pocket kings. You open raise from under the gun. Your super knit opponent 3 bets big. The action folds back to you. You feel like if you re-raise, you're never getting called by worse. He's obviously never going to fold aces, and you really don't think he's going to stack queens pre-flop in this situation, so you flat call. The flop comes out ace to 8 rainbow. What do you do? If you're out of position, what do you do? It's kind of a problem, right? Or let's make the situation just a little bit different than that. Let's say that villain is a strong, kind of a tag, tight, aggressive player in a full ring game. Say again at the same casino, the same 2-5 no limit game, and he opens to $20 on the button. You guys are a bit over 100 big blinds deep, and you have pocket kings in a small blind, and you decide to 3-bet $70, and only the button calls. And you go to the flop, and it's ace to 8. What do you do? I mean, what are you doing here? It's a problem, right? If you check, well, if you bet, first of all, you're almost turning your hand into a bluff, because your opponent, if they know what they're doing, is not going to give you action with pocket jacks. They're not going to call. I mean, they beat nothing, right? Except when they have an ace, and they're not going to fold an ace. So if they have ace queen or ace jack suited, they're never folding. And if they have a hand that is worse than pocket kings in a 3-bet pot, they're not going to give you a lot of good action. You might get 1 bet called. You might not, or you might have to check to induce a bluff, and that's great until he does it 3 times, right? When you check and he bets on the flop, you call. You check on the turn and he bets again. I mean, what are you going to do? You can call 1 more time, but if you do that and he bets the river, you're going to have to fold anyway. You're in a difficult spot. Now, what if we're in position? In either of those cases, let's say that we've got the nit under the gun, He open raises, we 3-bet, comes back to him, he calls. We've got kings, flop comes out ace 2-8 rainbow, he checks. It's easy, just check. You just check back, you just go to the next street. Next card comes off a brick. If he bets, you call. If he checks, you bet. It's easy. Easy, easy. Now, same thing. If you're the button and you open to $20, 4 times the big blind at the 2-5 game, and your opponent 3-bets to 70, and you think he's an ultra nit, but you also think he plays terribly post flop, and so you decide that your best, most profitable option is just a flat call. It's not rare. It's not often going to be the case where the best play is not going to be a 4-bet from the button against a re-steal. I understand that, but you could certainly come up with a situation where it did make sense. So just envision yourself in that situation. You're in the situation where it makes sense to flat call pocket kings against a 3-bet from the blinds, and the flop comes out ace 2-8. Your opponent checks. What do? You can bet flop, check turn, call river. You can check back, call turn, and then either call or bet river. It's a much, much easier situation to deal with. It's a little more complicated, I think, than the first example, not because it's a worse situation, because it's a little bit better situation. In this big blind versus button situation where we've under-repped our hand a little bit, we maybe could just go ahead and start value betting the flop. But you're in the driver's seat. You can decide. You can take things into consideration, like what is my opponent able to do? What does his range look like? Is he capable of check raising as a bluff? And is he likely to turn all of his hands that whiffed into bluffs if I check back? I mean, basically, you can look at this situation. When you're the button, you open raise, your opponent 3-bets, you flat call, flop comes out ace 2-8 rainbow. You just look at your hand like, okay, depending on whether my opponent makes more calling mistakes post-flop, betting or aggressive mistakes or compliant mistakes, whatever his predisposition is to mistakes, whatever his tendency is, whatever his mistake propensity kind of looks like. If he calls way too often, you can go ahead and bet for value. If he's very aggressive but doesn't like to give loose action, then you can check back and deuce bluffs and then call him down. If he's the type of player that's somewhere in the in-between category, then you could either bet flop, check turn, and then fold river or bet river when check to. I mean, you're in the driver's seat. Remember what happened. Remember what it's like. Actually imagine yourself in this scenario where you 3-bet pocket kings and are out of position, and the flop comes out ace 2-8. You have the pre-flop lead. What are you doing? I mean, you're almost at that point. If you decide to bet, you're turning your hand into a bluff, right? So I don't want to beat you over the head with this too much, but let's get these points across while we're on them. So let's imagine an example too that we have flopped a set, and we know somehow that our opponent either has pocket aces, he's either got an overpair, draw, or air. That's like, and a lot of times his range is going to look something like overpair, draw, or air, at least conceptually. Like when you break it down and kind of boil it down to brass tacks, you're going to play in a fashion that makes it similar to this scenario. But in this example, we somehow know that our opponent has either exactly pocket aces, exactly 5-4, or exactly queen jack suited, and we have flopped a set on king 3-2 rainbow. If we're in position and our opponent checks, it is the easiest thing in the world for us to just bet that flop. If our opponent bets into us, we can call or we can raise. Depending on stack sizes, I think I would usually wait until at least the turn to raise, depending on your opponent, depending on a lot of variables, but and a lot of it's going to have to do with stack size. Depending on how deep you're playing, if you're at least 100 big blinds deep in a single raised pot, you're going to have to raise on some street to get stacks in, to have a chance to get stacks in. And when you do that, you're going to get rid of a lot of your opponent's range. So if you're in position as pre-flop, let's say you were the caller of the pre-flop raise, you're in position. If your opponent bets the flop, you can just call with your set here. He's going to bet his aces on the turn. He's going to bet his 5-4 very often on the turn. And he's very likely to barrel some of the time with his air on the turn once you just call. If you raise, you have to worry about chasing out his heir. So, but you will get value from the aces and the 5-4 suited. But in this spot, because you're in position, it doesn't cost you that much to just call, because on the turn you're still going to have a chance to bet if your opponent checks. So but if you're out of position in the same exact scenario, if you're deep and you need to put a raise in to get stacks in at some point, whatever street you choose to do that on, you now take away from the number of hands in your opponent's range that we're going to bet had you checked, or I'm sorry, bet again if you called, and you risk your opponent slowing down with his entire range. So when you're out of position, at whichever point you decide to go for that check raise, you're going to blow his heir off. His heir is going to be gone, and that heir could very often have bluffed had you called. So you're not giving your opponent an opportunity to bluff more chips off into you, and you're spooking even hands like pocket aces that if your opponent's good enough, he may know that he should just be folding pocket aces to a check raise, against most opponents on a king 3-2 rainbow flop, or maybe if it's say your opponent has aces, the flop is king 3 deuce, you have pocket threes out of position, you check, he bets, you call. On the turn, if you check, he can check back, and you miss a street of value from a hand that you could have gotten 3 streets from. But if he's got queen jack suited here, and he was going to barrel the turn had you checked and called, hopefully you get the point here. And really, I think if you just put yourself in the situation, actually imagine yourself with pocket threes on king 3 deuce in position. It's very easy. Your opponent checks, you bet. Your opponent bets, you either call or raise. You wait for the right street, and then you put in the raise. But when you're out of position, knowing what to do, knowing, should I lead? Should I check and call? Should I check and raise? Oftentimes it's going to make the most sense to go for a check raise on the turn. But a lot of times, a guy, especially like in a tournament, against good players at relatively high stakes, when you look to check raise the turn against a good player, he's very often going to check that turn back and control the pot with his position. He's going to wield that positional advantage and take a hand like one pair. He's not going to turn it into a bluff. He's not going to risk getting blown off of it. He's going to bet the flop. You're going to call. The turn's going to come out. You're going to check. He's going to check back. And the river card's going to show up, and you're going to bet. He's going to call, and you're going to get 2 bets in against top pair, maybe even an over pair with a set. So you've flopped the best possible situation, and you get 2 bets in because you're out of position. Now flip that on its head. If you're in position and your opponent has the pocket aces, he's going to bet the flop. You're going to call. The turn's going to come off. If he bets, you're going to raise. He's going to be in a bind, or you're going to call, and the river's going to come off. And if he slows down and checks, you're going to bet and he's going to call. That's 3 streets. Or if he bets again, you're going to raise, and he's either not going to get the showdown with his aces, which is a terrible thing to have happen to your aces, or he's going to pay off another bet, and you're either going to stack him, or you're going to get at least 4 streets of value in. Okay, so examples 3 and 4. Just imagine this, kind of conceptualize this. We are in position with ace-king versus pocket threes. The flop is ace-7-3 rainbow. Okay, imagine what that feels like, because there is a feeling that comes in here. This feels, it feels okay, right? We're going to bet this flop. Your opponent calls. The turn comes out. It's another brick. You realize there's just no hands that you're going to get 3 streets of value from. Your opponent's in net. He checks, you check back. Or you think, well, my opponent's kind of a loose calling station, and I can go for a value bet here. You bet, he raises. He's never bluffing, and you fold. No big deal. Not that big a deal. Now, imagine the other scenario where we're out of position with ace-king versus 3-3 on ace-7-3. How in the hell do we get away from this hand? Worst case scenario, or best case scenario is we're going to check and call flop, check and call turn, check and call river. More likely, we're going to bet the flop, get called, bet the turn, get called, bet the river, get raised, and have to fold, or bet the flop, get called, bet the turn, get raised, not know what to do, or bet the flop, get called, bet the turn, get called, and we check the river because we wised up our opponent bets and we have to call. So we're losing, and really just kind of imagine the situation where you're out of position with ace-king on ace-7-3 against a nit. You bet that flop, he calls you, the turn's a brick, what are you doing? You know, it's not a comfortable situation to be in. Now you make the bet, he raises. Feel that. It's terrible, right? Kind of putting yourself into these situations mentally now, I think has the potential to think like a light bulb. Because I can tell you, there have been times when you've been sitting at the poker table thinking, what do? I don't know what to do. This is the weirdest thing in the world. This is such an awkward spot. Should I bet? Should I check? Should I check and call? Should I check and fold? Should I bet and call? Should I bet and fold? You don't have any clue what to do. And I'm telling you, almost certainly, every one of those times you've had that feeling, it's because you are out of position. Okay, so example 4, we're in position with 3-3 versus ace-king, or we're out of position with 3-3 versus ace-king on ace-7-3. Now, we pretty well just talked about that situation, so I'm not going to go over that again. So hopefully this is driving all of this to this point. Acting last, I mean in your mind, okay? Acting last means you act with more information, and your information is better. Acting last allows you to control the size of the pot more easily than your opponent can, and you're doing that with that information. Acting last allows you to get your showdown value hands to showdown with about one less bet going into the pot than you'd have to put in the pot if you were out of position, on average, roughly. Acting last allows you to apply one more street's worth of pressure with your bluffs when your opponent has capped their range. So let's say that you're in position for this last example. If you're in position and your opponent is pre-flop raiser and your opponent bets the flop and you call, the turn comes out, your opponent checks. Most of the time your opponent has just capped his or her range. And if you're in there with a draw, like even a gut shot with a couple of overcards, you can win that pot. You can bomb that turn and really put a lot of heat on the river. Your opponent's going to have to go away a lot of the time. So if your opponent's not using a very balanced strategy that has enough, say, slow plays and traps in it, and they check a street and you're in position with a bluff, you're really wielding a monstrous advantage. If you're not taking advantage of it, you need to start applying it. One more note before I close up here. When you are in position and your opponent is out of position, do not allow them to control the size of the pot. And players do this, and I see them do it live at the casinos a lot, and they get away with it. And I used to let them get away with it. You flop something like top pair with a good kicker, and your opponent leads into you on the turn. Like you bet the flop, and they call, and then your opponent leads into you on the turn, like a brick turn, for a very small bet size. And it feels so weird to raise with just like top pair with a decent kicker. But when your opponent bets like 20 into 60 out of position, they're attempting, most of the time, they're attempting to control the size of the pot. And they're using that kind of blocking bet as a means to stop you from putting more money in than they want to play for with their hand. And the way to turn that around on them is to utilize your positional advantage and say, look, you are out of position. You don't get to pot control. And the effort that you just made to pot control has actually blown up in your face, because now the pot's bigger and I'm going to raise you, and you're going to be getting a very good price to continue with a hand that's likely beat. So if they make a $20 bet into a $60 pot, click it back. Make it 40 or 45. Now they're going to be looking at just having to call a $20 or $25 bet almost automatically with whatever range that they were willing to make this little blocking donk bet with. I wanted to get that in at some point, because if you're finding it hard to beat up on your opponents when you're in position, it could be that you're allowing your opponents to make really a mistake, but they're making a mistake that you don't know how to counteract. So I just thought I'd throw that little tip or nugget out there. But okay, so hopefully you enjoyed the video, and if you did, let me know, and we'll do part 2 in the fundamentals series. Until next time, guys, it's Navinod. Over and out. Good luck.